Okay, I believe we are now in the webinar. Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for others to join us, and we'll start. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ozadeh Dastiari for the Iranians in the rooms that can pronounce that, otherwise as. This event that you are joining today is a collaboration between the Centre for Western Sydney and the School of Law, both at Western Sydney University. We've come together because the issues we are discussing today, protest, human rights, international law, accountability, human dignity, sit at the heart of our shared work and our values. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also acknowledge that many of you, including our panelists, are joining us from different lands across Australia, lands that were never ceded. Before we begin, I just want to share a few practical points today. We've done everything we can to ensure people's safety. The webinar is being recorded, but no participants will be seen or identified. If time allows, we'll open for questions at the end. So please keep in mind any questions that you may have for us. You're welcome to submit your questions at any time during the session using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Only the panelists will be able to see your questions, so please don't worry about that. I also want to provide a bit of a content warning. Today's discussion will include references to violence, to repression, and severe human rights abuses. I know this isn't new for many people joining us today, and I know especially some of the Iranian diaspora that have zoomed in will be living with this on a daily basis at the moment, as well as many other people who are witnessing extreme violence across the globe. But please do take care of yourself and feel free to step away anytime if you need to. As I said, we are recording this and we will make this available for anyone who might find it easier to digest this in smaller chunks. So we're meeting at a really critical moment. Since late December, some of the largest protests in recent years have taken place across Iran. The government has responded with extreme force, including mass arrests and lethal measures against crowds, leading to thousands upon thousands of deaths and injuries. An extended internet blockout has also been imposed, limiting coordination among protesters, restricting the spread of images and information, and reducing international attention. The stories coming out of the country are simply horrific, but the crackdown on information makes it very hard to really know the extent of the atrocities. The protests began with shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar, responding to severe economic crisis marked by high inflation, unemployment, and a sharp fall in the currency, but they quickly spread to other cities. Over time, many protesters began calling not only for economic reform, but for deeper political change, greater political freedom, respect for human rights, and in many cases, a transition away from theocracy towards a more democratic form of governance. As we will hear today, and as so many of you already know, this isn't the first time that the Iranian people have risen up against their government. My name, Azadeh, means freedom, because my people rose up against the government in 1979, thinking that my generation would see freedom in this country. But this protest movement has been met with one of the most brutal crackdowns in modern history. Many governments, as well as the United Nations, have condemned the use of lethal force and the restrictions on communication. Today, we're going to hear from experts who have studied, experienced, and reflected deeply on these issues. And we will also hear as directly as we can from someone on the ground in Iran. We had hoped to be joined live by a protester who has experienced and is experiencing the protests in Iran. But because of restrictions imposed by the regime on the internet, which makes contact difficult, And out of concern for the protesters' safety, they are unable to join us live today. Instead, we will read responses they have provided. Their answers were carefully drafted in Farsi and then translated into English. They have told us of their own personal experiences in a small town in the north of Iran across the days in which they started being active from the 8th of January. What you will hear are first-hand accounts from someone living through these events. We are awed by their bravery, as we are by the courage of so many that are calling for change, and grateful for their contribution to this conversation. To guide us through this discussion, I'm very pleased to introduce my esteemed colleague, Professor Christopher Michelson. Chris is Professor and Director of Research in the School of Law at Western Sydney University. He specialises in international law, human rights, security, and global governance. Before joining academia, Chris worked as a human rights officer with the OSCE in Warsaw. Chris previously held a tenured position in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW and comes to us with a great deal of experience on this topic and many others. For this first session, as we try to convey the protesters' words, Chris will ask me questions and I will read the protesters' answers. From there, we will hear from leading experts who will help us understand the broader legal, political, and human dimensions of what is unfolding. This is a really difficult conversation, but it's an important one. Thank you for being here, for your care, and for your solidarity. Chris.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, As, for that introduction and also obviously for collaborating with us in the School of Law in organizing this very important seminar or webinar, I should say. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land from which I'm joining, which is also the Baramatical people of the Darug Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. Yes, as was saying, I'm an international lawyer, so I have no claim to any specific country expertise on Iran. My claim to have expertise is on international law, and obviously I will try to do my best to infuse a few international law related comments with respect to the response or lack thereof of the international community, the qualification of the violence from an international legal, from an international criminal law perspective a little later on. But otherwise, it's my great honor to moderate the discussion a little bit with our speakers, and I will introduce our panelists one by one a little later once we get through the webinar and the conversation. But as we're saying, we're starting with a bit of a conversation with somebody from the ground, and I will pose a few questions, and as explained, she will answer them in the translated to English version. So without any further ado, I would like to ask the first question, which is, can you describe, based on what you've personally witnessed during the protest, how the regime responded to protesters and their demands in your surroundings?
Thank you, Chris. So again, I want to reiterate that I'm not speaking for myself, Professor Azdastiari. I'm reading the words provided to us by a protester living through the situation. In our small town, the total population is about 200,000 people. The number of protesters on the 8th of January was approximately more than 15,000 people. Protesters were completely unarmed, and the only thing some were carrying were 1 or 2 bottles of water. The reaction of the regime's forces to suppress the protest was different on the 8th and 9th of January. On the 8th of January, protests started at 7 p.m. It was from 11 p.m. onwards that the brutal repression took place in various forms, including beating people with batons and truncheons, shooting paintballs at protesters, other shots that only made a very loud and terrifying sound, throwing tear gas and other gases that we had not encountered in previous protests, such as Women, Life, Freedom a few years earlier. At first, our guess was that these were stronger types of tear gas that made some people feel partially paralyzed, breathing very hard.
Have we lost Az, or is it? have we lost Az, or is it just me who's lost Az?
No, we have
Okay, we
lost
have.
Az. I'm just trying to see how we can recover her.
Okay.
Am I back?
You're back, Az.
I don't want to read too much into what just happened. Um, I will continue to read the words from the protester. I'll start from on the 8th of January, protests started at 7 p.m. It was from 11 p.m. onwards that the brutal repressions took place in various forms, including beating people with batons and truncheons, shooting paintballs at protesters, other shots that only made a very loud and terrifying sound, throwing tear gas and other gases that we had not encountered in the previous protests, such as Women, Life, Freedom a few years earlier. At first, I guess was that these were stronger types of tear gas that made some people feel partially paralyzed, breathing very hard and unable to open their eyes. For our safety, we didn't use phones. And the next day, when I went to meet our friends who were among the protesters, I saw that 3 of our friends had red blisters on their bodies, faces, and around their eyes. We believe that the regime's forces used some chemical gases or agents in addition to tear gas. The form of repression changed completely in the second night and continued in the most violent way possible. The deadly crackdown began at 7 p.m. and continued until 2 a.m. Over several hours, the sound of shooting was continuously and uninterrupted. The regime's forces were brutally, deliberately, and purposefully targeting heads and faces with live ammunition and shotguns. They were even shooting at people from the rooftops of government centres and buildings with snipers. Some Basij forces carrying rifles, while others were additionally equipped with weapons such as knives. I personally witnessed 3 people being seriously injured by shotgun pellets on different routes we were protesting. One was a man about 70 years old who was shot in the head, neck, and face with shotgun pellets. The other was a man about 22 years old who suffered severe injuries in both eyes and was unable to see. The third was my husband, who was shot in the forehead, nose, and hands. Although some shotgun pellets were fired at me, none of them entered my body. Every few seconds, green laser lights were directed at the protesters, accompanied by the firing of live ammunition. In front of us, a man about 25 years old was shot twice, one in the forearm and the other in the arm. His wounds were so serious that his entire hand and his surrounding grounds were covered in blood. When we reached above him to help, he kept begging, "Please help me escape from the forces. Please don't let them arrest me." He knew that if the regime's forces caught him, they would definitely kill him. I took off my jacket to help him, but at the same time, 2 of his friends arrived and took him away on a motorbike.
Um, the second question I have is connected to, I think, a theme that will be revisited by some of our panelists a little bit later on, which relates to the way people communicate in these protests. And in specific terms, the question is, in what ways has the state's response to the current protests affected how people act, communicate, or show solidarity with one another? And how did people around you react when violence or repression began?
People's reactions range from shock, anger, sadness, fear, and anxiety to sympathy. On the 8th of January, the regime's forces used so much tear gas and other gases in our small town that we could barely breathe. In order to prevent the security forces and Basij forces from approaching the older people, several young people set fire to the garbage in a couple of large urban waste containers, and some others threw stones at the side of the street towards the regime's forces. In this way, they tried to force them to retreat and stop the crackdown. On the second night, on the 9th of January, the regime's forces chased the fleeing people and severely injured them with bullets and live ammunition. The only reaction of the protesters, including myself, was that we had to flee and take shelter in some houses to save our lives. On the 9th of January, the regime created an atmosphere of fear and terror by deploying militarized intimidation in the residential areas and main streets throughout the city, which started at around 10:30. hundreds of armed motorcyclists, military and police vehicles, and about 6 to 7 Basij and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces standing in pickup trucks whilst carrying firearms, rifles, and weapons such as knives, patrolling the city in a manner resembling a show of force aimed at intimidating the population. At the same time, pro-Islamic Republic marches were held, and many government employees, medical personnel, such as doctors and nurses, people who worked in pharmacies and street sweepers, and sanitation workers were forced to join the pro-regime crowd while wearing their formal clothes and holding photos of Khamenei. By forcing them to participate in this way in a pro-regime march, the regime intended to create the impression that various groups and classes of society supported the regime. Since the second night of the protests of 9th of January, they cut off all means of communication, both landlines and internet services, so we couldn't even call our friends and find out how they were doing. The next day, the 10th of January, the city was placed under martial law, and we couldn't even go out together. The regime's forces started investigating houses. They forcibly entered houses, especially those that had been reported or were known to be helping injured protesters or sheltering others. They checked the entire house to make sure to remove all Starlink and satellite equipment. And they even checked all the mobile phones to see if there were any videos or photos. If they discovered anything, they would arrest people immediately without a court order. The reaction of many people, including myself, to these acts was to delete the few videos and photos we had taken of the event. In fact, the regime was trying to destroy all evidence of the crimes in all possible ways. These actions severely hindered people's ability to document and retain evidence of crimes committed by the regime's forces. For days after these protests, martial law remained in effect. Currently, the atmosphere in the city is such that it is impossible to even discuss these issues in public. Due to the cutoff of all means of communication, access to information is so limited that I myself, who live in a very small town, has no information about the number and identity of those killed or arrested. People live in an environment of terror. In the current situation, a kind of forced silence has prevailed in the country, as any movement or word can endanger individuals' lives or freedom. In practice, it's not possible to take public action or effective action in any way.
The final question we have for the protester is about the understanding of the process outside Iran. And so the specific question is, what do you most want people outside Iran to understand about this protest as it is happening now?
The most important point for people outside of Iran to understand is that these recent protests are not the result of foreign incitement or external intervention. They represent a widespread revolutionary uprising of people of all ages and all social classes, driven by decades and decades of social and economic hardships, political and religious restrictions, and systemic gender discrimination. People took to the streets to defend their dignity, preserve their Iranian identity, and protect their fundamental rights and freedoms as human beings. The widespread repression and mass killings directed at civilians are not a consequence of protesters' actions or behaviour, but of a systemic and organised violence carried out by an extremist government that is driven exclusively by the desire to maintain its grip on power. You should know that both during and after the protests, a central demand shared by the majority of the population has been regime change. The Iranian people expect the international community to facilitate this process through recognition and support. Western governments cannot absolve themselves of responsibility for the mass killings in Iran. For decades, many states, including neighbouring countries and European governments, have maintained diplomatic and economic relationships with the brutal Islamic Republic, while with full knowledge and purposefully only for preserving their own economic benefits, overlooking this regime's systemic and gross violations of human rights. The active support and calculated silence of countries such as China and Russia, amongst many others, combined with the failure of international organizations in taking a decisive and timely action, has not only reinforced the regime's capacity to protect its illegitimate power, but has also enabled the continuation of brutal repression and violence in our country. By normalizing relations with this regime, the international community has betrayed the Iranian people and contributed to serious instability at both regional and global levels, causing populations beyond Iran's borders to also suffer from the regime's policies. The Islamic Republic is a terrorist regime. The Republic does not only perpetrate massacres of people living in its own territories, but creates instability and terror outside of its own borders. It has financed terrorist attacks, including in countries such as Australia, and has attempted to assassinate leaders all over the world. At this point, when extremist Islamic ideologies are spreading around the world, the existence and survival of this regime is a serious threat to international peace and security. The Iranian people's efforts to change this brutal regime are both vital and valuable for safeguarding global peace and security, which protects the safety of those in Iran as well as people in other countries. Again, they were the direct words of the protester who took the time and was brave enough to submit them to us.
Okay, thank you very much, Az, for relaying these impressions and first-hand account of what's going on. I think we will return to many of the themes and issues raised in these reports in our discussion now. I would like to now turn to our first panelists, participating panelist, and this is Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, and I'm very pleased that she's joining us. Kylie is an Australian writer and academic who specializes in Middle East political science. She's the author of the 2022 memoir, The Uncaged Sky, My 804 Days in an Iranian Prison, and she writes a regular column for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. The academic home of Kylie is Macquarie University, and she's a research fellow in security studies there. So welcome, Kylie. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll keep the format in a kind of conversational mode, and that means that I'll have three questions also for Kylie, and we were hoping that Kylie could provide us with a bit of broader context, I think, to what's happening, and obviously reflect on the basis of her personal experiences and views on that context as well. And so my first question for you, Kylie, is how has the state's response to the current protests reflected broader patterns of repression that you have studied or experienced firsthand?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. And a big thanks to Christopher and Azadeh and everyone at Western Sydney University for putting on this really urgent and important webinar. I'm so happy to be involved. This is obviously a really big question that you're leading with, and I was reflecting on it. I think, as we heard from the protester just then, actually, the January protests, and it seems silly to call them protests. I mean, it was a bloodbath. It was a massacre, really. I think it differs quite substantially from previous multiple cycles of protests that we've seen in Iran, particularly over the last decade or so. And one reason for that is the response of the security forces and the Iranian government, the kind of brutality and violence with which they responded, including using military-grade weapons and potentially chemical weapons against innocent, unarmed protesters. We haven't seen such a response before, when met by peaceful, unarmed protesters simply demanding their rights. And I think, that's one differentiation. And the explanation for that, perhaps, and another point of departure, is that the regime is at an unprecedented level of vulnerability right now. They see this as existential, clearly. And obviously the war with Israel, the 12-day war of last year, has a lot to do with that. The post-October 7 geopolitical situation in the region, where you've seen multiple proxies of the Islamic Republic fall or crumble, as well as, the Islamic Republic itself being shown to be incredibly vulnerable, both to the infiltration of Mossad, CIA, potentially others into the highest possible echelons of their regime. And the assassinations that we saw last year are a testament to that. But also they're militarily vulnerable. They don't even control their own airspace right now. They don't have their air defenses restored. They've lost a lot of their capacity to attack other actors in the region during that war, and obviously their nuclear program as well. So I think this is existential for the regime, and that is why the Supreme Leader gave the order clearly to simply kill, massacre anybody who's taken to the streets to demand the fall of the regime. And that's upwards of 30,000 people by many reports. So that's what's different right now. Speaking about my own experience and, the broader patterns of repression that have existed, in prior protests in the past in Iran, I was in Evin prison in 2019 during that protest movement, the so-called Bloody Aban uprising, which resulted in around 1,500 people killed in the streets and was triggered by a removal of gasoline subsidies in Iran. So similar to these protests in that it was an economic trigger that ultimately led to people to take to the streets to call for broader social and political change. And I was on the inside when hundreds and thousands and, I don't even know the numbers of people were suddenly being arrested and stuffed into Evin prison, to the extent that you had people sleeping in the corridors between prison cells because there was just simply not enough space to house them all. You had 24-hour-a-day interrogations. The prison guards were run off their feet as they were pulling people in and out of interrogations all through the early hours of the morning. Those prison guards themselves, I know, did not sleep. I mean, they would do a 24-hour shift and they would be awake for 24 hours. There was just, that much overcrowding and that much demand for interrogations. So I saw the repressive apparatus of the Islamic Republic from the inside during one of these protest movements. And I also was interned alongside a lot of female protesters of that Aban uprising, particularly in Qarchak prison, where I was relocated later on. And I think the approach is also different in that respect. And everybody's kind of very anxious and is waiting with bated breath to see what will become of the many thousands of people who have been arrested during this latest uprising. Many people are predicting a wave of executions and other extremely harsh sentences. My experience during 2019, again, I think shows that the approach of the regime was somewhat different. They did execute Navid Afkari, they did execute protesters who were arrested during that uprising, but it was, to make an example out of somebody to, I guess, act as a disincentive. Also, they killed 1,500 odd people on the streets, but those whom they did arrest, they mistreated, they imprisoned, they gave lengthy sentences to. But then quietly, as was often their way, a few months later, a year later, maybe a year and a half later, they started to revise some of those sentences and those punishments and extend so-called Islamic mercy or Islamic justice, pardoning many people, giving some of the protesters, for instance, that I'd been interned alongside, the opportunity to apologize and express regret for their mistakes in taking to the streets in order to compel a pardon and be released from prison. So there was that sort of understanding that this is unsustainable. Let's give people a second chance. Let's extend this so-called Islamic mercy to those, some of whom we had arrested. And I personally, I saw they have this ridiculous Human Rights Commission of the Islamic Republic, which is a contradiction in terms, obviously. And they visited Qarchak prison. They met with a lot of the female political prisoners. They recorded video testimonies from some of them. They weren't false confessions. They were these protesters expressing contrition in order to get a pardon, essentially. And it worked. Many of them did get pardoned as a result. So I saw attempts behind the scenes, first to interrogate and punish and brutalize protesters, but later on to kind of quietly remove them from the prisons and sort of give them a slap on the wrist and say, don't do it again. This time around, I don't think we're going to see that. And the level of brutality that, people have witnessed on the streets I think is testament to the fact that the regime is just throwing everything it's got at this, and there will be no mercy and no justice because it's existential now. And it's extremely depressing. I'd love to end on a hopeful note, but unfortunately, that's my current assessment.
Ali, you've mentioned the fact that the regime sees this as an existential threat, that it's very vulnerable from a military perspective, from a political perspective. So the question is, how, in your view, has the regime maintained its capacity to commit crimes against its own people, including mass atrocities and systematic repression, in light of this vulnerability? How have other governments through political, military, and economic support, strengthens the regime's capacity to commit this level of repression?
I think I broadly agree with the words of that brave protester in saying that there are a lot of other countries in the world that might not be directly complicit. Some of them might be actually directly complicit, but have had a hand in this extremely tragic series of events, this massacre. Because in a way, it's the resource curse. Many oil-rich, gas-rich economies have this concept of a resource curse in that the people of those countries, because of that resource wealth, and Iran has some of the biggest oil reserves in the world. I mean, should be a prosperous country as a result of those reserves, but of course we know it isn't. And often having such wealth brings both corruption, and we know the Islamic Republic is incredibly corrupt, but also the intervention and interest of all kinds of other geopolitical actors who see that wealth as something they would like to benefit from. And often that is in contradiction to the benefit of the people of that country. I don't think we would have so much interest in Iran if Iran didn't have the oil that it does. And in a way, the oil wealth has propped up this regime far longer than it really should have been able to last for. It's been using Iran's oil wealth to obviously buy weapons and set up its formidable security apparatus that it's used to crack down on and kill so many innocent people, and also to fund all of the terror proxies throughout the region that we know that for decades the Islamic Republic's been sponsoring. But also it means other countries have an interest in doing deals and perhaps obtaining some of that oil on discount, or even sitting down and working out other economic related or political related negotiations, not explicitly linked to oil, but perhaps informed by the knowledge that Iran does have this is sitting on this massive untapped resource. So we've seen countries like India and China buying Iranian oil at steep discounts on the black market in spite of sanctions, for instance. And this money, as with Russia, with the current war in Ukraine, it's been propping up the security apparatus and the military apparatus of the Islamic Republic and the IRGC beyond what it would have been able to had that oil not existed. We've also seen, frankly, disappointing levels of engagement from a number of Western countries, even the disgraceful behavior of Donald Trump during these protests, encouraging people to take to the streets, telling them help is on its way, that the US is locked and loaded and ready to go, and then nothing happened. Some of those people took to the streets and probably were killed because of Trump's words, only for him to back away and do nothing. And now, to spit in the face of the Iranian people by suddenly pivoting to talking about further negotiations with a regime that just murdered more than 30,000 innocent citizens. So it's, would Trump be as interested if that mineral and oil resource wasn't there? I wonder. It's a curse, I think, actually, for the Iranian people. So we've seen, a number of regional countries obviously involve themselves. There was plenty of reports too about Iraqi Shia militia proxies of Iran taking part in the massacre too. Something that I noted when I was in prison was the prevalence of Chinese surveillance technology, CCTV tech that was used to monitor, voice recorders, tech used to monitor prisoners. Evin was much more high tech than Qarachak was, and I think the more sensitive the prison, the more likely the regime's going to invest money in some of this surveillance technology. But there was very much the expectation that China is partnering with Iran and is rolling this stuff out, not only in the prisons, but, we've got reports of facial recognition and probably AI-powered facial recognition tech being used by CCTV cameras on the streets of Iran to monitor hijab compliance, for example. So there's a sort of an axis of authoritarian rulers all backing each other up here, and Iran is very much part of that. The Islamic Republic is, and China, I think, is engaged in helping to enhance and strengthen that repressive apparatus within the country that has enabled this current crackdown as well. So there are a lot of bad actors and a lot of actors out there that unfortunately have made the situation worse in Iran, in my view. And drawing attention to this and naming and shaming and strengthening sanctions, and more importantly, strengthening the enforcement of sanctions, because, a lot of these individuals and entities that have been sanctioned, they've been conducting their business regardless. So I think rather than adding to the sanctions, actually enforcing them properly and really stridently will be key. But we need to see the political will from some of the big powers, particularly Western powers, to do so. And I'm just not sure that we're there yet, unfortunately.
I'd like to acknowledge some of the questions that have already been submitted in the panel to us, in the chat panel to us. And I think some of these questions we will get to as part of our conversation as well. If not, if we have time towards the end, obviously we can take them up. My final question for you, Kali, picks up on something you've actually already said in response to the first question. About the significance of these protests. You were saying that these are different, these protests, or the response by the regime is different this time because it's perceived to be existential, and so that has a really adverse effect on the level of repression, on the level of violence that's being committed. But looking forward, in your view, what might be the legacy of the current protests, for the lack of a better word, or if you have a better word to use, please do so.
I think it's inevitable that things are going to shift as a result of this bloodbath. My understanding from the few friends I've been able to contact on the ground is that everybody is still in shock. They're still digesting what happened. Information is still coming to light. The dust hasn't properly settled on this yet, and it will probably take many months before it does, if ever. But I think, unfortunately, this has shown the majority of people inside Iran who oppose the regime that peaceful protest, non-violent resistance isn't enough. That's the lesson that we've seen. In previous rounds of protest, we saw lots of people be killed by the regime, but not in the same brutal militaristic fashion that we've just witnessed now in the past month. And I think the lesson here is, that this regime has no red lines. It will do whatever it takes to stay in power, even if that means killing tens of thousands of innocent people in the streets, young people, the next generation, the best and brightest of Iran. I think there'll be an inevitable shift then to think, well, how could we readdress this structural imbalance here? And there's a lot of dangers in that. And I think that's one reason why we've seen prominent people associated with opposing the regime inside the country and outside the country calling for foreign intervention, calling for Trump to bomb Iran, calling for anyone to come and save them and help them, because there is this recognition that non-violent peaceful protest will not cut it. This regime is prepared to do anything to stay in power, including killing non-violent protesters. So aside from, my sense is that the people in Iran broadly do not want to take up arms against the regime. Nobody wants to see a civil war in Iran or anything like that. So I think that, calling for foreign intervention is the easiest step, but I'm not sure that is either wise or feasible. Is anyone actually going to come in and remove this regime for the Iranian people, or is this something that still essentially Iranian people need to do for themselves? That being said, I think it's pretty clear that the regime is in terminal decline. There's no way a government can come back from such a brutal massacre. The clock is ticking. And I mean, we know that the supreme leader is an elderly man. He's 86. He's probably not in very good health. His lifespan is pretty limited, whether he dies by natural causes or not, or even is removed before he dies. I mean, I think his time is limited. What happens next? And I think, unfortunately, more likely we are going to see a shift in the nature of the regime rather than a wholesale removal of the regime, absent some kind of mass intervention from, externally. Um, these kinds of transitions are often messy. And there's a lot of, from what I can see, and I don't want to dampen anyone's brilliant, fantastic, beautiful sentiments toward democracy and democratization, but there seems to me to be a lot of utopianism still alive, especially in the diaspora, around somehow magically making this regime disappear and then installing a secular democracy that's going to rule Iran with respect for human rights and remove corruption and all of these other issues. It's really, really hard to get there. And I cannot see a way forward without, dramatic events first taking place to get rid of this ruling regime. And it really, really feels very difficult right now. I think it's more likely going to be some other form of authoritarian transition post Khamenei, but I don't know how that will look, and I hope I'm wrong. I think the ethos is there. The Iranian people are desperate for democracy. They're desperate to be able to decide, the manner of government that they want to choose for themselves, and they want freedom. They want to be able to live their lives like everybody else in the world and not live under an ideological pariah state, whose ideology is very much not that of the street, of the regular everyday people who live in the country. But yeah, I mean, I think in the short term, at least, my expectations are quite bleak. Longer term, it's important that ethos is there and that yearning and desire for democracy is there. I really hope that we'll get there and that Iran will be a flourishing and free democracy. But I think the path forward to remove these guys first is looking really, yeah, really bleak.
Thank you very much, Kylie, for your insights. We might move on to the next panelists, but would like to come back to you as part of our discussion time if we have some time later on. So thank you again for your insights. I think they also nicely lead to the focus of the conversation with the next panelists, Dr. Amin Ansari. And Dr. Ansari holds a PhD. I introduce Dr. Amin Ansari first. He holds a PhD in Communication and Media Studies from Flinders University in Adelaide, where his research examined the intersections of media, power, and political resistance. He has published 5 novels exploring migration, political repression, and exile. He's the founder and president of Mardam Foundation, a human rights non-for-profit organization that advocates human rights in Iran and mobilizes existing resources to confront state violence and systematic repression. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Ansari. I mean, it's a pleasure to have you as part of our panel. And I might just shoot away with my first question, which is Iran has a long and complex history of protest and popular uprising. In fact, Kylie was mentioning earlier the 2019 protests as well. But it would be very, I think, useful for the general audience if you could address a little bit how the current protest movement sits within the longer history of resistance in Iran.
Oh, Christopher. First of all, let me say hello to everyone. It's really nice to be here. It's a pleasure to be in this conversation at this very moment. Thanks for the coordinators of the meeting and also the other guests. Yeah, as probably mentioned in many ways in the context that's laid out now, this is not the first time Iranians went to the streets and asked for freedom and tried to express their willingness and basically their whole idea about what they want. If we go back to the history of the regime, we're talking about 47 years of brutality against anything that's against their idea. We're talking about the first days of this regime, filled with executions, tortures, imprisonments of the previous regime, and then years to come, to see a lot of mass murders, all those political groups who felt they can imagine a better democratic Iran after the Shah, and then all the betrayals in that period. Then we had those reformist movements come after that, in which the people and the reformists hoped for some gradual changes in the behavior of the government and the nature of this brutal regime to basically step by step correct the wrongdoings in this government. And then later, as the situation got worse and worse, the intentions became different. The front of people against the government had many, many more reasons to resist and show their willingness for a better Iran, for an Iran for everyone, an Iran that's democratic enough to prevent any kind of dictatorship in the future of it. Of course, the intentions changed. Of course, the reasons that brought people to the streets of the world changed, but one thing remained the same, and that is until there is oppression, there is resistance. And this is not going to be changing as a rule, despite what happens next. Like, we don't know, and no one can really claim that they know what happens next. But what is there for sure is that people will resist. People will continue resisting until a change comes true. And to be honest, this is just another iteration of this attempt. There might be different there might be different slogans, different chants, different organizations, different faces on the streets, on the television, etc. But what's the same is that a nation, despite of the differences and their ideologies and their perspective of the future, XYZ, a nation trying to change the game in their favor. And another thing that I want to just point out is that, unfortunately, being an Iranian is a very hard thing at this very moment in history. We try to emphasize that we have this willingness and idea, and we want to change, and we will change the dynamics here. But unfortunately, Iran is not an ordinary country. Like, looking at the south, at the north, at the east, and the west, there are countries around the world that are basically stakeholders at this poker table. And from time to time, you see that we have some more cards in our hand, but again, it's not going to be the whole thing. You need to change the situation. It's not going to cut necessarily. Like, just imagine Iran as an element in another proxy wars around the world at the moment. Like, it's not only resources, it's this geopolitical situation that we are in. We are at the intersection of many things and many layers. And to be honest, if I want to picture a future for Iran, I can't see it only in people's hands. We can do whatever we can, but at the end of the day, some international equations should be straight so that an action comes out of this current situation. So that's...
Thank you. I mean, you mentioned the complexity politically, internally, regionally, internationally, the different layers. And so that the follow-up question actually relates to the people inside Iran and the diaspora both shape the protest movements. What sort of ethical and practical challenges come with that shared influence?
So I have been a part of the diaspora for the last 15 years ago, and me as a person of this community outside Iran, and Azada is probably going to have her own account on this, I changed over years. So that Amin who actually came out of the country after the 2009 uprising and started doing his PhD in relation to that uprising and had his own ideas at that time is a different person. Sometimes I can't relate to it. So I can't understand that the diaspora gradually morphs into a new phenomenon compared with people who are living inside Iran, who are dealing with their everyday problems with this government and probably having a different taste. I just want to acknowledge that. I don't want to say that what people are saying outside of Iran are necessarily aligned with the intentions, specifically with the blackout that we are facing and the gag order basically that's in place. It's very hard to claim that we know exactly what the overall population is asking for and what kind of approach is more aligned with that. We have evidences of the process. We have like chants. We have the documented courage on the street. We saw people came to the street understanding the dangers of it. And the message is very clear for themselves and to the world that they want the situation to change. So that's very clear. So what the diaspora does and did in the past, in whatever way they could, over many years and decades, is to echo that voice, but understanding that the voice might change in different layers of communications and with all the limitations that we are facing with. But what you're seeing, what you're hearing from the diaspora is basically an interpretation of that message of what happens in Iran. Of course, as you mentioned in your question, there are challenges. There are ethical challenges here. Not being sure that the solutions that are being concluded here are exactly what they want, not understanding the context of some of the situations they're facing is one thing. And also not acting because you're not sure is another challenge. So a lot of people, they're saying, we don't know exactly if the story is true, if X is right, if Y is wrong. And those kind of hesitation in taking action in favor of people can also create damage. So it's very, very hard to have the right position at this very moment. What's happening, though, is that despite the differences in perspectives, Iranians are again delivering a message to the world that something has to be changing here. And if you are a stakeholder in Iran, if you are earning money out of the situation, if you're negotiating using Iran as a leverage in your conversations with other countries, if you want the oil, if you don't want Iran to be a strong player in the region in terms of resources, technology, X, Y, Z, whatever your interest in Iran is, the message for you is clear, and that is we want the change to happen. And if it doesn't happen now, it happens later, because these 90 to 100 million people around the world, and mainly in Iran, they want this change, and they're not going to settle like people who have been in this game of protesting and living the sense of being in opposition to the government of Iran over these many decades. They understand that the expectation is not that the change comes now. Maybe the public, because of the pain and the stresses and the energy that's accumulated in the community at this very moment, feels that something happens next week and the future, I mean, the tomorrow is bright. But people who have been in this game, they understand that it will be a long run. And for the long run, they're prepared to fight.
Thank you very much, Amin, for those insights. In the interest of time, we might move on to our final panelists, and then we
Yeah, sure.
might come back later to the points you've raised, which I think interconnect with what Dr. Yazdan Mansourian will be talking about. And I welcome him to the panel discussion as well. And I'd like to introduce him, like with the other panelists as well. So Dr. Mansourian is a senior lecturer in the School of Information and Communication Studies at Charles Sturt University here in Australia. However, he received his PhD in information science from the University of Sheffield. In his ongoing research program, he explores the role of joy and other positive emotions in engaging people with hobbies, amateurism, voluntary activities, and how joyful experiences inspire them to seek, share, and use information. Now, we've heard from our protester, obviously, that in the case of the protests, there is no joy in sharing any information, but rather it puts them at risk, that's very serious risk to their health and bodily integrity to share that information. And so I would like to pose a first question to Dr. Mansourian. How does the Iranian government use censorship, internet and landline shutdowns, and surveillance as tools of control and collective punishment, both to suppress protests and conceal violence, and to restrict what families inside and outside the country can know about events on the ground, thereby limiting their ability to respond or take action? And I think this is a dynamic that was very well reported by the protester as well. The fact that people are leaving their phones at home. And yeah, over to you, Dr. Mansourian. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for organizing this webinar. It's my pleasure to be here. Sorry I was late because, ironically, I didn't have access to the webinar because my computer started to restart several times. So I have a very recent lived experience of lack of communication just before this webinar. At the beginning, may I just recite a few lines of Persian poetry by one of our contemporary poets, Mehdi Saleh, which basically describes the situation, especially the internet blackout. Of course, he wrote this poem many years ago, but it still summarizes the situation. I read it in Persian first, and then I will translate. Of course, there are many people I can see, so they don't need the translation. He says, ره هر پیک و پیغام و خبر بسته است، نه تنها بال و پر، بال نظر بسته است، قفس تنگ است و در بسته است. Which means it's not possible to send or receive any messages. The means of communication are blocked. You are like birds that have not only had their wings clipped, but deprived of possibility of imagination. We are in a cage with closed doors. So, answering your question, basically, this is a form of collective punishment that the regime is using by denying access to information. It's a form of deliberate information deprivation. So, which cause basically, I can call it epistemic vacuum, which is a form of epistemic injustice. So, people don't have access to accurate, reliable information. And then by censoring information, by this internet blackout, they want to manipulate everything. They want to create their own narrative of reality. And then they leave people in absolute uncertainty. They don't know what to believe. They don't know how to verify information. And then this situation creates an environment for more disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is deliberately misleading information by a regime or an organization just to mislead people and hide the truth. And obviously, when disinformation distributed, then misinformation will also be there when people cannot verify the accuracy and reliability and credibility of information. So basically, they use all these techniques to hide the violence they have done and to leave people in uncertainty. So they cannot make a decision. Without information, you cannot protect yourself, you cannot make a decision, you cannot communicate with people, you cannot seek for help. So after 2 weeks that there were no way to communicate with Iran, no internet, no landline, eventually we managed to call each other. And when our relatives, our family, friends called us, they didn't know what happened. They were inside the country, but they didn't know. So that's the method they are using. And obviously, I'm talking here from my own discipline, information science. So they use it for controlling the sources of information, by controlling the way that people cannot share the information, just for collective punishment. And this is against basic human rights.
Thank you very much for this first answer. I have a second question directly following up on some of the themes you've already touched on, and that is, how does a complete digital blackout affect society beyond just blocking information? For example, impairing healthcare services and threatening the protection and fulfillment of wider human rights in society.
Yes, basically, as you said, it goes beyond blocking information because it disturbs all the way of communication. And for example, you mentioned healthcare, because imagine a hospital without telephone, how they can operate. They cannot call their doctors, they cannot contact their nurses, and they cannot operate in normal days. So basically, they have no resources because it's not possible to reach to the resources. And then after a while, of course, we can see the consequences right now. It will have an economic impact. There are millions of people in Iran who uses this social media for their own business, for their small businesses. They cannot operate. So it affects the economy as well. And also it creates isolation for people, and in long term it will damage people's social and emotional well-being. So it's not just about information. As you said, it goes beyond that. And we already see the consequences, that people feel lonely because they cannot communicate, and it will affect their well-being, their overall well-being.
Thank you very much for those insights on the communication side of things. I now hand back to Az.
Thank you very much. And we will be coming back to everyone on the panel because I can see there's some fantastic questions for all of you coming in. Just a reminder to the participants in this webinar that you can submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And as we wait for you to do that and to add to the already existing questions, I'll take this opportunity to ask my own colleague, to ask Chris, because as a scholar of international law, human rights, security, and global governance, I think your views here are really important as well. So Chris, why has the United Nations and the UN Security Council not intervened in response to the atrocities? Excuse me.
Yeah, so that this is also a very big question, and I try to be brief in my response and do a very probably not doing justice to a very complex set of political and legal issues, some of which have actually also been mentioned in the question. There is a question about the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which is a doctrine under international law. The question is whether it has legal status, but the idea is that it allows for intervention into the domestic affairs of a state in instances where that state is not fulfilling its obligations to protect the basic human rights of its peoples, which is obviously the case in Iran at the moment. But coming back to the United Nations, I think three or four brief points I would like to make. The first is that obviously the United Nations, as many other international governmental organizations, are not an actor that takes its own decisions. It functions through the collaborative work of states. Now, with respect to the United Nations, obviously the Security Council is the organ within the organization that is mandated to address issues of peace and security. And that provides a limit, I think, to what the United Nations, what the Security Council can do as well, because according to the Charter of the United Nations, the Security Council needs to make a finding that a certain situation amounts to a threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression before it can take certain enforcement powers. Now, in the history of the United Nations, large-scale human rights violations, for example, in Somalia, Liberia, have been determined to constitute a threat to the peace. So that would enliven the enforcement powers of the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the Charter. So from a substantive legal perspective, I think the large-scale violence and human rights violations that are occurring in Iran totally qualify as a threat to peace and security, notwithstanding that they are internal. That is internal violence and not interstate violence. The problem, of course, is a political one, and I think as was mentioned in some of the responses by the protesters. I think Kylie made reference to it as well. We have, of course, the situation on the Security Council that we have 5 permanent members on the Security Council that, which hold a veto power. The 5 permanent members are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and now critically Russia and China. And so it is very unlikely that the Security Council would intervene in the current situation due to a possible exercise of the veto power that is held by Russia or China, who I think would see any intervention into the internal, as they perceive it, internal affairs of the state as violation of sovereignty and potentially with significant ramifications for their own situations in their own respective countries. So I think, and that is to say that this blocks, I think that paralyzes the council with respect to a response to the most recent mass violence being perpetrated by the regime. However, I should say that the Security Council has acted in the past, not with respect to the widespread human rights violations, but rather with respect to the nuclear program in Iran, and which was suspended in 2015 by the Security Council, but which in fact in September of 2025 so-called snapback mechanism was reenacted. So there are currently UN sanctions imposed on Iran. There are other sanctions imposed on Iran by regional actors, by individual countries. So there is some international legal pressure, but I agree with what Kylie was saying earlier. It's not necessarily the lack of some of the adoption of sanctions, but it's rather a question of enforcing those sanctions. And I think from a legal perspective and also from an Australian perspective, this is an area where I think governments can take some initiative in ensuring that the sanctions which are already in place are enforced in greater detail. Having said that, and goes also to one of the questions put in the chat box, regime change as such is unlawful under international law. So we have a paradox here that, protesters inside Iran were hoping to maybe for, the United States to intervene militarily. But from an international law perspective, any such intervention would actually be in violation of international law. And regime change as such is not a recognized ground for intervention. The final point, just to respond to the R2P question, the R2P, the responsibility to protect doctrine, has largely been, I think, a political doctrine and is controversial under international law because it challenges initially it challenged the authority of the Security Council, because it allowed for a mechanism to intervene into the domestic affairs irrespective of Security Council endorsement. In the World Summit Outcome document of 2005, the R2P doctrine was somehow brought within the auspice of the Security Council and is supposedly guiding the Council. But as I said before, that is not well supported by Russia and China. And so I don't see this R2P doctrine being of any being a helpful framework here to channel international solidarity or international cooperation with a view to exercising more pressures on the regime.
So one more question for you, Chris, if you don't mind. Given that answer, do you think that the Iranian regime can be held responsible under international criminal law?
Yes, so that's a very interesting question, and it also goes, I think, to some of the issues and themes that we've, I think, addressed collectively as part of the panel with respect to recording what's actually happening, which also, I think, contrasts the situation in Iran quite significantly to, say, the situations in Ukraine or in Gaza, where obviously there's 24/7 recording of the atrocities that are being committed, which I think is a very important aspect when it comes to establishing accountability and criminal responsibility in the medium to long term. Now, from an international law perspective, I should start by saying that Iran is not a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which is the main treaty that establishes individual international criminal responsibility for what we call as international lawyers mass atrocity crimes. So there are four mass atrocity crimes: the crime of aggression, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So these are obviously there's a long history dating back to the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals. But these are four crimes which have been incorporated into this ICC, the Rome Statute of the ICC. Now, from a legal perspective, Iran is not party to it. It's only a signatory. But if a state is only a signatory to a treaty, it does not trigger substantive legal obligations for that state. So there's a difference between being a signatory to a treaty and a party. And it's only once you're a party to a treaty that you assume international legally binding obligations. Iran is not a party. Now, you can make an argument that crimes against humanity, for example, which are clearly being committed, I think, in Iran as we speak. It's a very long definition, so I won't bore you with the definition. But basically, crimes against humanity mean different acts when committed as part of a widespread and systematic attack directed against any civilian population, which not with knowledge of the attack, and that includes murder, enslavement, torture, rape, sexual slavery, enforced disappearances, and other inhumane acts of similar character, intentionally causing great suffering. And obviously, it's clear that many aspects of the crimes of this crime against humanity are being committed by the regime. But as I was saying before, the problem is Iran is not a party to it. So the mechanisms of the International Criminal Court established to prosecute these crimes do not kick in here. There is a way around it, but there is, again, unfortunately, a catch-22. The way around it is that the Security Council can actually refer a situation to the International Criminal Court, irrespective of whether the country in question is a party to that treaty. So if the Security Council in the present context would refer Iran to the ICC, that would give the ICC jurisdiction to start an investigation. But that takes us back to my previous answer and the problem that obviously is very unlikely that the Security Council has done so before. For example, in Sudan, in Darfur, it has referred the matter. Darfur, Sudan was also not a party, and it referred the matter to the ICC, and the ICC started investigations. But because of the likely veto of Russia or China, this is very unlikely to happen in this instance. So I conclude by just saying that I think it will be of vital importance in the medium term to document as best as possible what's going on, because this is, again, I think from the evidence that has been reported, that we have seen, there's not a single doubt in my mind that this meets the actual components of the crime against humanity, and there are political and jurisdictional issues at the moment that prevent prosecution, but I think history has shown us that things can change, and I think that's also the more optimistic view. The fall of the Berlin Wall happened more or less overnight, and I think the fall of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia happened unexpectedly. So I think things can change, and when things change, then I think these international crimes will assume great importance. But in order for them to be prosecuted, there is, of course, a dire need for evidence and for the collection of documentation of the violence that's currently being perpetrated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I've got a question for Dr. Ansari. Looking at the present moment, what do you think the current protests reveal about the evolving relationship between state power and popular resistance in Iran?
The short answer is we are done with this regime. This is the short answer. I believe in the previous rounds of protests and movements against the government of Iran, the government was successful in isolating the victims of an oppression or suppression. For example, in Aban, where Kylie referred to, they actually isolated the narratives to specific regions in Iran, specific ethnicities, and tried to keep the body of the community away from the atrocity, saying that this was a very specific situation, and because of the national security, we had to deal with it in a brutal way or whatever. And so while the public would judge that situation still, but somehow, because the everyday life is ahead of them, and they have no direct reason to interfere in that situation, they become okay with just going ahead with their lives. What happens over years, I just provide another example as well, with the student movement and what happens many years ago, even before the Green Movement, the government used the same strategy to isolate the students from the rest of the community, so that that intersection of pains doesn't happen. What happened in 2022 with Women Life Freedom Uprising was that for the first time, we saw the different layers of the community, for many reasons, got together and created that beautiful picture of unity and supported each other in the protest against them. And still, in that situation, while a big part of the community were asking for basically regime change or a radical change in the structure of the system, there were a big part of this community as well that were okay with radical reforms in the system. But here in 2026, we're sitting here and we are seeing a very angry population that's not actually buying any story about reform, which is a great progress in the process of getting rid of a brutal regime like Iran. And so I just want to make clear something that I mentioned in my first response about the voices in Iran and the complications in the narrations. I just want to know, just want to make it clear that it's clear that some of the voices at the moment are unifying in major ways around the name of a person called Reza Pahlavi, the prince of the previous Shah in Iran. There's no doubt, because I saw a comment in the comment section. I just want to make it clear. From academic perspective, from research perspective, I can't just confirm that it's the voice of every single person in Iran. My comment was about that. And more specifically, my comment was about, I don't know if I know that every single person's solution to the situation is, for example, a military attack on Iran. That's from academic perspective, I have to mention that. It's not something that we have access to any specific statistics. We are seeing this general narrative around it, and it's rooted in a real situation, in real reasons. And the reason is, as Kylie also mentioned, I don't know if someone else, like the witness from Iran also mentioned, it's a dead end in any sort of conversations about negotiations, about nonviolent protests. In those areas, there is dead end. We face that. This is what really happened. And we saw that this government has no limits in oppressing or suppressing people. And this was more than anything a statement from the government what happened. They're saying, we are going to stay here no matter what is the cost. And it's not only a message to Iranian people, it's a message to the international community that any interference might actually end up in a very complicated situation. So just going back to your question about the evolving relationship between the public and the state, I would say there might be an imagination of some sort of bridges between these two bodies in the previous rounds of protests. Now there's no bridge, at least at this very moment. And we know that from propaganda perspective, they will do their best in the coming weeks and months to create some bridges between the public and the government, to negotiate somehow directly or indirectly through media production, through engaging celebrities, through whatever they did in the past as well, to basically show that there is a way out of this situation without getting rid of the regime. However, what's happening in people's mind is rage and anger towards this government, which is limitless. And what we as public, I think, want internally, externally, is to see a change, as I mentioned in my previous answer. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, just want to add one more thing in relation to what Christopher mentioned. I believe, yes, there are some legal limitations around it, and it's very understandable that there are limitations there. And I understand that previously, through sanctions and other legal actions internationally, the international community tried to show that they're taking action on Iran. I just want to emphasize and underline the fact that whatever that happened, what regular ways that the international community tried were not enough. It's not doing the job that people of Iran are asking for. This is not happening. Yeah, just wanted to underline that this is not working. Yeah, thank you.
We have some really thought-provoking, wonderful questions in the chat that we as panelists can see, but we're running out of time. And one question that keeps being asked in various forms is what can people who are in this webinar do? So we've got questions like, how can the world help innocent people who are taken hostage to have a democratic transition? Which role can scholarly associations in Australia and other parts of the world play at the moment? With all the complications in this situation, what is one suggestion that the panelists would provide to Iranians outside of the country? What could we do to truly help this revolution? And in various forms of the same question over and over again. Does the panel have any ideas of what could be done by people who are desperate to help?
I can start. I think there's been an utterly shocking amount of misinformation and deliberately so. There's been a very effective campaign, much of it probably coming out of the Islamic Republic and other countries, governments, entities that support the Islamic Republic online to tar this as some kind of foreign instigated uprising, that these are people are Mossad agents, spies, etc., and to even mock the dead and just shocking stuff online, a sort of a fire hose of it being spewed out in various well-subscribed online spaces, and speaking up against that and demanding that mainstream media cover what's happened in Iran more than it has, keeping Iran on the agenda in every country in the world, not just the United States or wherever might actually have influence. Demanding that the human rights atrocities that have occurred in Iran be given the same coverage as atrocities elsewhere. I think it's really, really important trying to counter some of those narratives, because I've actually been shocked. I've never actually seen the extent of such a mis and disinformation campaign that we've seen against this massacre in the last few weeks happen before. So for me, I think it's really important to speak up as much as possible to counter some of those narratives. And also, I think that Western governments can assist the Iranian opposition in the diaspora to push them, to prod them, to pull them to each other and come try and develop some sort of consensus, some sort of opposition in exile, some kind of group of prominent individuals or organizations that can try and unite, because the divisions within the opposition internally and externally, as well as those distinctions that Armin spoke about between what the people on the ground in Iran actually want and what the diaspora wants, which I sense is slightly different too. It's really playing into the regime's hands. It's enabled them to divide and conquer, essentially, as they have historically over many decades. So I do think in terms of building democratization and building an alternative for Iran, Western governments can play a role in trying to form some kind of coalition of opposition forces in exile, to try and build up an alternative to the Islamic Republic that could potentially help Iran transition if this regime was to fall.
Thank you very much, Kylie. And perhaps, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, and we'll end it there. I just want to thank Chris for the amazing work that went into organising this with us, our wonderful panelists, the extraordinary protester who put their life at risk in order to give us a testimony so that people in this webinar could hear from the ground what the experiences of someone going through this is. This isn't an abstract issue. We're sitting here at an event organised by a university, often talking in academic tones about incredible cruelty and violence and horror. And for anyone that might have access to this in Iran, we just want to say that we see you as much as they will allow us to see you, and we hear you as much as they will allow us to hear you. And there are a lot of people around the world that do not accept what is happening. The hope is that one day we will be in a seminar like this and it will be a very, very different conversation. But for now, thank you so much to everyone that has been involved in this, and the record numbers of people that actually joined this webinar. We're very grateful for your solidarity. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.